I was joking, Michael. Paul McCartney's voice came through the phone line, tight and controlled, but underneath you could hear something raw, something like betrayal trying not to sound like begging. It had taken 3 days to get Michael Jackson on the phone. 3 days of calling his office in Los Angeles, leaving messages that got more urgent each time, waiting for callbacks that didn't come. And now, finally connected, after a reporter had told Paul that Michael Jackson owned the Beatles catalog, after Paul had read the news story twice because it couldn't possibly be true, after he'd gone home and sat in his study staring at the wall for an hour, this was all he could manage to say. I was joking, Michael. Michael Jackson, sitting in his home studio at Havenhurst, surrounded by gold records and Grammy awards and the evidence of being the most famous person on the planet, took a breath. He could hear everything Paul wasn't saying. You were supposed to know that was a joke. You were supposed to understand that friends don't do this. You were supposed to ask me first. You were supposed to care that these were my songs. Michael said, very quietly, 2 words. I wasn't. Wait, because those 4 words total, I was joking, and I wasn't, were the final exchange in a story that started 3 years earlier in a recording studio, when Paul McCartney made what he thought was a casual, ironic comment about buying the Beatles catalog, and Michael Jackson wrote something down in a notebook, and neither one of them understood they were about to destroy their friendship over $47.5 million, and a lesson about the difference between advice and confession. The story that led to that devastating phone call started 3 years earlier, October 1982. The studio was Westlake Recording, the same room where Michael had been working on Thriller for the past 8 months. They were supposed to be finishing The Girl Is Mine, the duet that would be Michael's first single from what would become the biggest album in history. But the session had finished early. The track was done. The vocals were perfect. Quincy Jones had left an hour ago, and now it was just Paul and Michael and the engineer in the control room, sitting in that strange quiet that always follows creation. And that's when Paul McCartney, relaxed, joking, completely unaware he was about to make the most expensive comment of his life, leaned back in his chair and said it. You know what the best investment in music is, Michael? Publishing, song catalogs. He was grinning, that easy Beatles grin that had charmed the world for 20 years. The Beatles catalog is worth a fortune, and it's up for sale, but I can't buy it back because Yoko would never agree to it. He laughed, gestured casually with one hand like he was tossing the idea away. You should buy it. Michael Jackson, 24 years old, sitting across the room in his red leather jacket, didn't laugh. He just picked up the small notebook he always carried and wrote something down. Paul saw him do it, didn't think anything of it. Just Michael being Michael, always taking notes. The engineer noticed it, though. Noticed how Michael's face didn't change, how his pen moved slowly across the page like he was solving an equation, not jotting down a joke. Michael looked up from his notebook. How much? Paul blinked. What? How much would it cost? Michael's voice was quiet, curious. Paul shrugged. I don't know, mate. 40 million? 50. It's not actually for sale right now, I'm just saying, theoretically. Michael nodded slowly and wrote something else down. Paul glanced at the engineer, raised his eyebrows like, is this kid serious? The engineer just shrugged back. They moved on to other topics. Paul told a story about recording in Hamburg. Michael asked about bass lines. The moment passed. Paul left the studio around 7, gave Michael a hug, told him the duet was going to be massive. Michael stayed behind, sitting alone in the control room, staring at the 2 words he'd written in his notebook. Publishing, catalogs. Stop for a second, because you need to understand something about how Michael Jackson thought about money. This wasn't about greed. This wasn't about beating Paul McCartney. This was about the one lesson his father, Joseph, had drilled into him since he was 6 years old. The one thing Joseph had gotten right in a childhood full of things that went wrong. Own your work, Joseph had told him, over and over. that the real money in music wasn't in performing, wasn't in the fame, wasn't in the screaming crowds. The real money was in ownership, the masters, the publishing, the rights. Joseph had lost the Jackson 5's early work to Motown because he'd signed bad deals, and he'd never let Michael forget it. Every contract Michael signed after that, Joseph was there, pointing at the fine print, saying, "This is where they steal from you. This is the line that matters." So when Paul McCartney, one of the most successful musicians in history, casually mentioned that owning song catalogs was the best investment in music, Michael didn't hear a joke. He heard confirmation. He heard a Beatle, someone who'd done it at the highest level, validating everything his father had been saying for 18 years. And when Paul mentioned that the Beatles' catalog was theoretically available, Michael didn't hear impossibility. He heard opportunity. That night, Michael called his lawyer, John Branca. Branca had been working with Michael since 1980, and he'd learned to take Michael's instincts seriously, even when they sounded crazy. Michael asked him a simple question. If someone wanted to buy a music publishing catalog, how would they do it? Branca explained the process. Music publishing was complicated, but the basics were simple. You found a catalog you wanted. You valued it based on its earnings potential. You made an offer. You negotiated. Michael asked another question. What's the biggest catalog in the world? Branca thought for a moment. ATV Music. It owns about 40,000 songs, including the entire Beatles catalog. But it's not for sale, Michael. Michael was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Find out if that's true." Notice something here. Michael wasn't impulsive. He didn't rush. He asked Branca to research, to investigate, to verify. Over the next 2 years, while Thriller became the biggest album in history, while Michael performed the moonwalk at Motown 25, while he won 8 Grammys in one night, while he became the most famous person on the planet, he was also quietly learning everything he could about music publishing. He hired consultants. He studied catalog valuations. He read contracts. He met with executives who specialized in intellectual property. He asked Branca to track ATV Music's financial situation. And in 1984, 2 years after Paul's joke in the studio, Michael learned something crucial. ATV Music was in trouble. The company that owned the Beatles' catalog was drowning in debt, and the Australian businessman who controlled it, Robert Holmes, a court, was looking to sell. The catalog was going on the market. Remember, this was 1985 now. Michael was 26 years old. Thriller had sold 40 million copies. He was making more money than any performer in history, but $47.5 million was still an almost unimaginable amount to spend on something you couldn't see or touch, something as abstract as the rights to songs. Michael's financial advisors told him it was too risky. His accountants told him to invest in real estate, in stocks, in tangible assets. Even Branca, who believed in the idea, warned him that this was the most expensive gamble of his career. If the Beatles' catalog didn't generate the revenue projections suggested, Michael would be tied up financially for years. Michael made the offer anyway. $47.5 million for ATV Music and its 40,000 songs, including 250 Beatles compositions. It was the highest bid. In August 1985, the sale went through. Michael Jackson owned Yesterday. He owned Hey Jude. He owned Let It Be and Come Together, and Here Comes the Sun. He owned the songs Paul McCartney had written in Hamburg and Liverpool and Abbey Road. He owned the soundtrack to a generation. Paul McCartney found out from a reporter. He was in London doing an interview for a music magazine, and the journalist asked him, casually, how he felt about Michael Jackson buying the Beatles catalog. Paul's face went blank. "What are you talking about?" The journalist showed him the news story, fresh off the wire. Paul read it twice. Then he stood up, ended the interview, and left the building. That's when he made those calls. 3 days of trying to reach Michael. 3 days of messages that got more urgent. And finally, that conversation. The silence after I wasn't lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt longer. Paul tried to explain. He'd been trying to buy the catalog for years. Those songs meant something to him that they couldn't mean to Michael. He thought their collaboration, their friendship, would have protected him from this. Michael listened. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just said very simply, "You told me it was a good investment. You were right." That was the end of the conversation. They stayed polite, stayed professional, but something had broken that would never quite heal. Years later, in interviews, Paul would talk about it with visible pain. He'd say he felt betrayed. He'd say Michael had taken advantage of their friendship. He'd say he'd taught Michael about the music business, and Michael had used that education against him. Michael, for his part, rarely discussed it. When journalists asked, he'd say it was just business, that he'd made a smart investment, that Paul had given him good advice, and he'd followed it. But people who were close to Michael said he never quite forgave himself for hurting Paul, even though he never regretted buying the catalog. Here's what most people missed about that phone call, about that whole situation. Michael wasn't trying to hurt Paul, he was trying to survive. Listen, because this is the part that only makes sense if you understand Michael's entire childhood. From the time he was 6 years old, Michael had been making money for other people. Berry Gordy at Motown had owned his voice, his image, his songs. His father had controlled his earnings. Lawyers and managers and record executives had gotten rich off his talent, while his family lived in a small house in Gary, Indiana, wondering if they'd ever see the real profits from all those hit records. By the time Michael was in his 20s, he'd watched his brothers, talented performers in their own right, struggle to make money from their own music because they didn't own their masters, didn't control their publishing, didn't have power in the only place power actually lived, the contracts. So when Paul McCartney told him, almost as a throwaway comment, that the secret to real wealth in music was owning catalogs, Michael didn't hear it as friendly advice. He heard it as the key to freedom. He heard it as the answer to every financial anxiety he'd carried since childhood. And when the opportunity came to buy, not just any catalog, but the Beatles catalog, the most valuable collection of songs in history, Michael saw it as validation. If he could own the Beatles, he could own anything. If he could control the songs that had defined popular music for a generation, then nobody could ever control him again. The irony, of course, is that Paul had been trying to teach Michael the same lesson. Paul had spent 20 years trying to own the Beatles catalog for the exact same reason: to control his own legacy, to stop other people from profiting off his work, to have power over the songs he'd created. The tragedy is that they wanted the same thing, but only one of them could have it, and the one who got it was the one who'd taken the advice literally instead of understanding it as a lament. Michael's ownership of the Beatles catalog changed the music business. It proved that artists could own not just their own work, but the work of their predecessors, their influences, their heroes. It sparked a wave of catalog acquisitions in the 90s and 2000s. It showed every young musician that the real game wasn't getting a record deal or selling albums, it was controlling rights. And it made Michael Jackson, already the biggest star in the world, into something else: a businessman who understood the industry better than the executives who ran it. But it cost him Paul McCartney. They performed together once more, years later, at a benefit concert, and the photos from that night show two men who'd been close, who'd respected each other, standing next to each other with careful smiles. They were polite, they were professional, but they weren't friends anymore. That joke in the studio in 1982, that casual comment about buying the Beatles catalog, had created a fracture that never healed. The catalog itself became one of Michael's most valuable assets. It generated millions of dollars every year in licensing fees, royalties, performance rights. When Michael died in 2009, it was worth an estimated $1 billion. He'd bought it for $47.5 million. It was, objectively, the best investment of his career. But Michael told a close friend once, late at night after a concert, that every time he received a royalty statement showing how much the Beatles songs had earned, he thought about Paul. He thought about that afternoon in Westlake Recording. He thought about the way Paul had laughed when he'd suggested Michael buy the catalog like it was the most impossible, ridiculous thing in the world. And he thought about the phone call. "I was joking, Michael. I wasn't." That exchange, those 6 words total, became the defining moment of Michael's business career. It showed what separated him from almost every other artist of his generation. He'd listened when someone had told him where the real power was, and he'd gone and taken it, even when taking it meant losing a friendship, even when taking it meant being called ruthless, even when taking it meant carrying guilt for the rest of his life. Michael had learned, growing up under Joseph's brutal instruction and Motown's exploitative contracts, that the music business was not sentimental, it was not forgiving. It did not reward loyalty or friendship or good intentions, it rewarded ownership. And when Paul McCartney had casually, jokingly, mentioned the most valuable thing you could own in music, Michael had written it down in his notebook and then spent 3 years making it happen. Years later, when Branca would talk about that era, he'd say the ATV purchase was the moment he realized Michael Jackson wasn't just a performer, wasn't just an artist, wasn't just the most talented person he'd ever met. He was a strategist. He was someone who could hear opportunity in a joke, who could turn a casual comment into a business empire, who could sit patiently for 3 years waiting for the right moment to strike. Branca said, Michael had called him the night the catalog sale was finalized and said something that stuck with him forever. "My father told me to own my work. Paul told me how. I'm just doing what they both taught me." If you enjoyed spending this time here, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. A simple like also helps more than you'd think. The story of Paul McCartney's joke and Michael Jackson's note isn't really about who was right or who was wrong. It's about 2 different ways of understanding success. Paul thought success meant staying loyal, meant protecting your friends, even when they were also your competition, meant understanding that some things, like the songs you wrote when you were young, the songs that defined your entire career, should remain yours by some unspoken moral right. Michael thought success meant taking every opportunity, meant learning from everyone, meant understanding that in business,